Power scaling in One Piece can often be tricky at times because each person goes about it in their own different way. Whether it be through facts, feats, evidences, portrayal, narrative, we try to find the right mix and ratio between all of these to judge how strong or weak a character might be within the verse. But at the end of the day, there's no exact unit of measurement for power scaling, and this is why there are so many different and opposing stances across the community. But I've always been a big believer that the most important measurement is portrayal. Any and every time I attempt to scale a character's strength, I've always prioritized portrayal first and foremost, and even if that character has little to no feats at all. But let's talk about why portrayal is so important and why I think it's more important than feats, titles, bounties, and pretty much anything else when it comes to power scaling. And if you do get enjoyment out of today's video, then consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It helps me go a long way in making these videos for you guys. Portrayal is defined as a depiction of someone or something in a work of art or literature. A good example of this would be Kaido's portrayal during his introduction. We're told that Kaido was captured by the Marines many times, but every time they tried to kill him using different methods, nothing could ever work on him because of how durable his body was. Then we find out immediately after that his reputation for his strength across the One Piece world is so high that he's said to be by many the strongest living creature. Even without his Yonko title, this initial depiction of Kaido during his introduction made it clear to us that he was one of, if not the strongest living person in the world, without him needing to even raise a finger. And it's only after this that we actually see him in action during the Wano arc, and his feats then come into play and more or less match the portrayal that was given to him. Another example would be the 5 men that Kaido saw behind Luffy after getting hit with the Red Rock. Sure, we already knew these men were great pirates with substantial fame and strength, but even if we knew nothing about them at all, we knew enough about Kaido. By that point, we saw so much from Kaido in terms of both feats and portrayal that he had solidified his place as a top tier. And by simply suggesting that Luffy's ceiling and maximum potential reminded him of these men, instantly off of that alone, we know these men are at the very least relative to Kaido and able to give him a serious fight. So what makes portrayal so important? Portrayal is the foundation of a character's stance in terms of strength. Feats are often volatile with characters. They may have some really impressive showings in one arc, but then prove to be a lot more disappointing in the future. Or start off with lackluster feats, but then seemingly increasing in strength drastically without literally changing at all. But with portrayal, the portrayal will always be the most consistent thing about them. If a character isn't represented or implied right from the start by Oda to be at a certain level, if they aren't given some kind of reference point in terms of power, then they can fall off relatively quickly because there's nothing holding them to that standard. Whereas if a character is immediately given a reference point from the start, they are already established at a certain level, and no matter how much the story progresses, they won't get left behind as badly. Let's take Crocodile for example. Crocodile was introduced initially during the Alabasta saga. This was a really early point in the story, before the Straw Hats gained any substantial amount of strength to really last in the Grand Line. And Luffy defeated Crocodile one-on-one by the climax of the arc and moved on to the next island and the next antagonist just like that. The same way he did with Kuro, Don Krieg, and Arlong. But then a few arcs go by, Luffy has fought more enemies and has gotten a lot stronger with new power-ups and techniques. And Luffy meets Crocodile once again in Impel Down, frees him, and then they proceed together into Marineford. Yet at Marineford, Crocodile seemed like a whole new person. The same man who lost to Luffy pre-Gears is now going toe-to-toe with pirates and marines Luffy wouldn't last 5 minutes against. And on top of that, they all seem to respect him as a peer and someone who has earned his place amongst the higher echelon of fighters. Doflamingo shows keen interest in Crocodile, offering him to work closely together now that he is no longer a warlord. And we see him clash with the likes of Mihawk and Doflamingo, and giving the likes of Akainu and Sengoku a hard time even if briefly. Regardless of how short or insignificant those clashes may be, at the end of the day, if this were anyone else we were talking about who lost to a pre-Gears Luffy, they wouldn't even be worth any of these men's times. They would most likely be dealt with just as quickly as Mihawk dealt with Mr. One. But this wasn't the case with Crocodile. So is this then inconsistent with Crocodile's character? How is it that he lost to a much weaker version of Luffy, but is now clashing with people far stronger than the current Luffy was with all his new power-ups? At face value, this doesn't make any sense at all, but with the right context, it actually does. And this is where portrayal plays a major role. With context, we know that Crocodile wasn't new to the Grand Line when he fought Luffy in Alabasta, and his One Piece wiki states that at one point in time, Crocodile's dream was to become Pirate King. He once went to the New World and grew adapted to its erratic environment, but shortly after rising to the rank of warlord in his early 20s, he suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Whitebeard, and this brought an end to his dream of becoming the Pirate King. 16 years prior to the current timeline, at age 30, Crocodile relocated to Alabasta. The crocodile we saw in Alabasta was a former shell of himself. He had already lost hope and given up on his dream, and now just wanted to form a small-time organization and live as a big fish in a small pond, no longer wanting to compete with the elites. We even see evidence of this in how he speaks to Luffy about dreams and the goal of being Pirate King one day with an extremely pessimistic nature. And even so, with Crocodile virtually at his lowest point, he still managed to beat Luffy not once but twice, and it took Luffy all but 3 tries to finally take him down. And just for reference, there is only one other character throughout the story who gave Luffy 2 losses and took 3 fights to finally bring them down. And that character is of course Kaido. And this was all way back in Alabasta. Luffy losing in a fight even just once was completely unheard of at the time, let alone twice. And sure, all of Luffy's fights prior to this were challenging and forced Luffy to grow as well, but we never really thought Luffy could ever actually lose in any of those fights. He always won in the end, every single time. That is up until Crocodile. So if you guys are liking the video so far, why not go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated and helps me go a long way in making these videos. So please subscribe. When I look back on this fight, I never see it as a conflict of strength resulting with Luffy overpowering Crocodile. What I see is a conflict of ideologies between a man at the end of his dream who has already given up on his aspirations and now hates to see those same aspirations kindling in the hearts of other young pirates, such as Luffy, against a fresh, young up-and-comer full of those same hopes and dreams that he himself once had, but without the bitterness or humiliation that came after his defeat to Whitebeard. This was Luffy's first actual challenge since entering the Grand Line, and if he couldn't get past Crocodile, his first real obstacle, then what hope did he have at all for his dream? Not to mention the actual state Alabasta was in at the time and why it was so important for Crocodile to be removed from a political standpoint. Luffy was more determined than ever, and Crocodile didn't have any real reason to be so determined. Of course, his position in Alabasta, his spot as a warlord of the sea, and even his plans to take the ancient weapon Pluton were all potentially on the line. But these were never his actual aspirations to begin with. He had already given up on the things most important to him a long time ago, and had already adjusted to a more weak-willed attitude. So how hard could it be to give up on this? What Luffy versus Crocodile really came down to wasn't who was stronger, but who was more determined. Crocodile proved to be the stronger of the two by beating Luffy twice, but Luffy proved to be the more determined by coming back each time until the job was done, until Crocodile said enough was enough, that the effort was no longer worth the reward. But even though Luffy defeated Crocodile, he was still a long way from being a warlord of the sea, or experiencing the new world, or fighting the likes of Whitebeard, all of which Crocodile had already done. Even in his loss, with the right context added, Crocodile's portrayal was far greater than Luffy's. And this is why when we see him once again in the Summit War saga, he seems like a completely different man from a strength standpoint, doing things in the war that even Luffy couldn't do, facing off against people Luffy couldn't. Because during the Summit War, for the first time in a long time, Crocodile had something to fight for once again. We see him constantly reiterating again during the war that his goal and all he cared about is to not let the Marines have their way, as revenge for imprisonment and removal from the warlord status. And in his last scene before the time skip, Crocodile and Mr. One are seen recovering from their wounds on some island, and Crocodile states that he once again is going to the new world. At first take, this doesn't seem like much, but it's what this represents for Crocodile that makes it so huge. We just saw the massive difference between the Crocodile in Alabasta and the one we got at Marineford, simply because he had a stronger dedication during the Summit War. And now that Crocodile had just a small taste of that dedication he once had, he's far more impressive than we, or even Luffy, remember him being. And if this is what he is like with just a little bit of determination, then what about a fully determined Crocodile, with a renewed dream to enter the new world and become Pirate King once again? The same determination that led a 20-year-old Crocodile to fight to a standstill with Douglas Bullet. The same determination that led Crocodile to becoming a warlord and fighting Whitebeard himself by as young as his early 20s. By Crocodile stating he wants to go back to the new world, Oda is basically telling us readers that the Crocodile of old is back. And I'm not even talking about the narrative aspect here, with the classic trope that if a character returns to the story after a long time, they will automatically receive a huge strength boost in order to remain relevant and keep up with the growth the Straw Hats have made, like we see with Rob Lucci and Kaku. But I'm speaking strictly from a portrayal aspect when it comes to Crocodile. Dreams are one of the biggest themes in One Piece. There is no stronger driving force than having a dream to fight for, and now Crocodile has that once again. In a sense, Crocodile is what Luffy would have become if he never met Jinbei. In the same way Crocodile suffered a humiliating defeat to Whitebeard and gave up on his dream entirely, Luffy suffered perhaps an even worse outcome at Marineford and came really close to following down the same path. I want you guys to imagine where Luffy would be now if Jinbei was never there to help him remember what he was fighting for. Sure, he probably would have still gotten somewhat stronger after the 2-year time skip, but he wouldn't have come anywhere close to the progress he made now if he had given up on his dream. Luffy's time skip was a major success, resulting in him becoming multiple times stronger because of his reason to keep pushing. Aside from his Nakama, it was his dream that kept him going, the dream he almost gave up on. When Luffy completes his training and is ready for the next chapter of his journey, it's this same dream and simply stating it as proudly and with as much conviction as possible that he gives to Rayleigh as the best way he knows to say thank you. By Luffy showing Rayleigh that his dream is not only mended, but stronger than ever, he's also telling Rayleigh that everything he did in the past 2 years to help Luffy was not in vain, and will one day pay off tremendously. That the Luffy who was completely defeated and came so close to giving it all up was gone, and that the Luffy of old was back, the same way that the Crocodile of old was back. And this is the depth with Crocodile's portrayal that we didn't get with Enel, or Lucci, or Arlong, or even Katakuri. And it's because of this that no matter how long it took for Crocodile to return back to the story, I always felt certain that he would return stronger, that he wouldn't suffer from the effects of a power creep like so many other characters have, or that his drastic increase in strength would come out of nowhere strictly for narrative purposes, and that he would come back as a character of relevance. And even though we haven't seen too much of him so far, his new position as a Yonko commander of Cross Guild and his bounty of just under 2 billion is a testimony to his abilities. The reality is that Luffy is lucky to have gotten out of Alabasta with his life, because Crocodile was that much stronger in every way. But it isn't a flaw in the story or even plot armor that got Luffy out, as much as it was in Crocodile's own flaws and self-doubts about himself and his dreams that led to his defeat. So although his feats in Alabasta were poor in hindsight, it's his portrayal that was more important and the foundation of his character, as it's his portrayal and not his feats that remained consistent with him all throughout the series. And Crocodile is just one example of this, but far from the only one. Mihawk at best has average feats so far, and his position as a commander under Buggy doesn't help his case either. But it's his portrayal of being the world's strongest swordsman, being rivals to Shanks, and being a man who was never interested in the Yonko position to begin with, that raises his status both in the One Piece world and to all of us readers, as one of the very strongest characters in the series. Because of his early establishment through portrayal, Mihawk doesn't really have to do anything to prove he can easily compete with admirals or even Yonko. It's something we all already know. Not long ago, Shanks was also a character with little to no feats at all. But even more so than Mihawk, Shanks has never needed feats in the first place. His portrayal was always so great that no matter how strong other characters seemed to be, we already knew Shanks was at the pinnacle of strength and able to hang with the best of the best. In the same way Kaido was an apprentice on Rox's crew, Shanks was an apprentice on Roger's crew, an even greater pirate. And Roger took a serious interest in Shanks by giving him his hat when Shanks was still at a young age. Roger, the king of the pirates himself, saw something in Shanks when he was just a kid. Whitebeard had a great level of respect for Shanks, and when they clashed, they split the skies. Kaido sees Shanks amongst the likes of Roger, Whitebeard, Rox, and Oden, and Shanks is the only person alive that Kaido sees in that regard. The Marines were determined to continue the war even after their goal was accomplished. Akainu was hell-bent on getting to Luffy at all costs, and Blackbeard was on a power trip after eating Whitebeard's devil fruit and at his highest point of confidence he's ever been, self-proclaiming himself as the strongest man in the world and challenging both Garp and Sengoku to try and stop him if they can. But when Shanks arrives, all of it stops. Akainu doesn't take another step in pursuing Luffy. Sengoku ends the war upon Shanks' request, and Blackbeard, who just claimed to be the strongest man in the world, who just moments ago was glad to fight Garp and Sengoku together, backs down from a direct challenge from Shanks and flat out states that he is not yet ready to fight Shanks. And just like that, with his mere presence alone, the war is ended. Boa Hancock is the pirate empress and captain of the Kuja Pirates, a nation that excels in the usage of hockey, specifically armament hockey. And Boa is not only the leader, but the only one to possess the ability to use Conqueror's hockey. She was a confirmed user of all 3 types of Haki early on before she even got an opportunity to display her strength, and she's respected and even feared by some of the strongest characters. We see how seriously someone like Blackbeard takes her when he attempts to ambush her on Amazon Lily. Even someone like Blackbeard, an emperor, doesn't take her lightly and chooses to sneak up on her in order to avoid direct conflict. And when he has her in his grasp, he even states that if he were to let her go, she would petrify and get the better of him instantly. Even with minimal feats, Hancock has always had great portrayal as one of the strongest warlords we've ever seen. And it's no surprise she was given a bounty of 1.6 billion. And it's not even from a narrative aspect when it comes to Hancock, because we have no idea how big or small of a role she will play in the plot for the future. Nothing is really guaranteed with her, like it is for Blackbeard or Shanks or Akainu. With Hancock, it's merely her portrayal that raises her so high. This is why portrayal will always be the most important aspect of gauging a character's strength. It is by far the most consistent aspect of a character. Without portrayal, Oda can move a character around as freely as he wants, drastically changing their level of strength when it comes to feats, for whatever purpose that serves the narrative at that time. But when portrayal is firmly established within a character, it's a lot harder for Oda to just abandon that portrayal for the sake of moving the story in a certain direction. And when he does put one of those characters in a position seemingly unfitting to their portrayal, it usually comes with just cause and unique circumstances within that character's own motives, and in the end, circles back to remaining perfectly consistent with their portrayal above everything else. Because portrayal is the foundation. Portrayal is everything. More videos coming soon, subscribe so you don't miss it, and as always, thanks for watching.